When was the last time that you pondered, if ever, the architecture and layout of your church building or youth room? And does architecture and layout even matter? Should our spaces be purely utilitarian in nature, or should they serve an even greater purpose? Winston Churchill once said, "First we shape our buildings, and then our buildings shape us." The fact is that space does speak, and space can shape us in ways that lead to our spiritual flourishing, or space can undermine our spiritual growth and development. Dr. Bill McAlpine has studied and written on the power of sacred space. Stay with us as Marv and Duffy Robbins join me for an eye-opening conversation with Bill McAlpine about our churches and youth rooms on this episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Youth Culture Matters. I'm Walt Mueller here at CPYU, and actually I think we've had a podcast worth of humor already just trying to get set up for this one because I've got a couple of my friends on, Duffy Robbins and Marv. We'll get to them in a minute, but just trying to get all the tech working here. We've got some unusual situations, has been fun. So this will make for a good podcast, and the topic we're going to deal with today is a good one as well. Just to introduce that a little bit, we're going to talk today about an issue in our youth ministry culture, and actually in the larger ministry culture as well, that we don't really think about a whole lot. We want to prompt some thinking today. One of the things I've noticed in the Facebook groups, and a lot of us track with the Facebook groups for youth ministry, Download Youth Ministry, youthmin.org, and some of the others, is that we spend a lot of time having conversations about things like, teaching, what are you teaching, talk about staff relationships, problems and issues we have. We share games, we share programming ideas, we talk about mission trips. But we've seen a lot that's been happening on the Facebook groups increasingly where we talk about visual things in youth ministry and space issues, space aspects of youth ministry. What I'm talking about here is like, hey, look at my logo. What do you think of my logo? Or does this T-shirt work? And then a lot of time is spent talking about youth rooms. What do you think of my design? What do you think about the paint colors? What do you think about the kind of furniture we have here or the electronics we have in the room? And so those conversations there have gotten a few of us thinking about, is that really important? As we think about those things, certainly we need to have space to meet in, and we want to design our space well. But is there something deeper other than just style? Could there possibly be some theological reflection that would be necessary and helpful to help us design spaces that really help us to accomplish what it is we're trying to do in our ministries with evangelism and discipleship? I've noticed as well a lot of images that have popped up where people are talking about their youth rooms, where they'll show a youth ministry meeting, and some of the places are incredibly impressive in terms of, it's almost like a rock concert, with the fog machine and the lighting and the staging and all of those things. And I want to broach that a little bit as well. I mean, are those things neutral? Do we need to think more theologically about that? So I've invited a couple of friends in. Duffy Robbins is here, and Duffy, everybody knows, teaches youth ministry at Grove City College. And Duffy and I do some teaching together at Gordon Conwell. We've been friends for a long time. Duffy and I have had these conversations. And then Marv Penner's joining us. Marv is actually in the northwest part of the country right now at Multnomah University. And Marv, just explain what you're doing right now, because we've got extra guests in the room, because this is actually part of a classroom time for you. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. I'm teaching a class up here. The topic of the class this week is adolescent faith formation. So what we're talking about on this podcast is directly related to the topic of the class. I've got 8 master's level students in the room here, all of them full-time in ministry. They're at the end of their second year of this master's level program in youth ministry, headed up by Dr. Rob Hildebrand, who heads up the youth ministry program here at Multnomah. So we're having a great time, and I'm grateful that the students will get the benefit of this podcast firsthand, and hopefully they'll be able to bring some questions and some perspective to the topic. All of them do their ministry in rooms somewhere, and so we're all in this conversation together.
That's great. We're glad those folks are here, and they may be firing some questions as well a little bit later through Marv. So the guest we have, as we've talked about these things amongst ourselves, we've tried to figure, who has thought about these things more deeply. And Marv mentioned that he has a friend, Dr. Bill McAlpine, who has written a book called Sacred Space for the Missional Church, subtitled Engaging Culture Through the Built Environment. Bill is an associate professor of practical theology at Ambrose University College in Calgary, Alberta, and he's joining us. Bill, thanks for coming on to talk about this. We know you've thought about this quite a bit.
My pleasure, Walt. Thanks so much for the kind invitation.
Well, okay, you heard a little bit of the introduction there, and some of my concern is, based on my own experience personally, about what has or has not gone on in my head as a practitioner in youth ministry, and then some of the things I'm observing, is that we're disconnecting our practices, let's say, our behaviors, let's say, in terms of space and architecture and design of our space. We're divorcing that or separating that out from theology and belief. And in the beginning of your book, you say this. I would argue that the church cannot thrive, let alone fulfill its mission in the 21st century, without a comprehensive understanding of the praxis component inherent in the theology and hermeneutic of the built environment. Talk about that a little bit, and then we'll jump into some conversations beyond some of those big words.
Yeah, that was just to impress the 2 academics that passed my dissertation. But really, this whole topic of the theology of sacred space or the built environment is something that really quite ambushed me. I didn't go into my doctoral program with this in my back pocket. But as I reflected back, I'd been a pastor for over 15 years, for a few years with Marv, best 2 years of my life. And and I'd been involved both as a pastor and as a layperson in a number of building programs. Okay, now I come from the conservative evangelical background tradition. So typically we look at our buildings through the lens of fiscal feasibility and utilitarian, just how is this building going to function? Is it going to keep the rain off? Is it going to allow us to do what we want to do? But basically, for all intents and purposes, it was an inert container. It did nothing. It said nothing. It meant nothing. And as I reflected on my years as pastor and then started to do some thinking academically and having conversations with people outside my tradition, particularly Roman Catholic, Episcopal, Orthodox, and so on, I came to realize that really on a global scale, we as evangelicals are in a minority when it comes to seeing the significance of the built environment. The idea, it took me a while to get my head around the fact that there is a theology to the built environment. And what that said to me, Walt, was that for all intents and purposes, my spirituality, when it came to the built environment, was largely Gnostic, in the sense that the material world was really not that important. The most important thing is the spiritual. We want to save souls. And as an evangelical, we have a hard time taking our body seriously in general, and specifically how our body relates to and is impacted by the environments where we minister, live, worship, and have our being. So I started to do some self-reflective analysis of where I had been as a pastor and when I look back on it, there was one exception. It was the church where Marv and I served together, Baby Glen in Toronto. And my first week on the job there, our senior pastor, Arnie Reimer, took me into the sanctuary and he exegeted the sanctuary. There were theological statements inherent in that space, the positioning of the pulpit, for example, the baptistry. Those were not just functional access, egress, aesthetics. They were theological statements. And up until that point, that was the only evangelical church that I had been in that even took it seriously. So that's where my journey began, and it continues. And I'm still very much involved in reading, and I've been consulting with other churches and so on. So a bit of a background, Walt, as to where I got to where I was. Now, when I use words like the hermeneutic of the built environment, all that stuff, that simply means that the built environment is a statement that needs to be and will be interpreted. That's the hermeneutic of it. And whether we want it or not, or realize it or not, people will interpret the vernacular of what our spaces are saying. It will impact them. They will make judgments on us as churches before they hear the preacher preach, based on the environment that we have asked them to be immersed in. So, and it's our Catholic friends and others, they've been doing this for 16 centuries. They look at me kind of bemused and say, "Really, Bill? You guys are just getting this now? We've been doing it since the 4th century." It's changed a lot of how I think. It's changed my philosophy and my theology, and it's impacted how I actually worship God to a large degree.
Yeah, and by the way, Duffy and Marv, chime in. You know the rules here. There are no rules. Just go ahead and chime in whenever you want. But I did a thing here a couple of weeks ago on a couple of those Facebook groups where I asked the question, just said, "Hey, informal survey. This is to youth workers. What do you call the main room where your church gathers on Sunday mornings?" Because I think names apply to this, right? Because implicit in a name is what we think the space is for. And I hear what you're saying about functionality there. So I said, what do you call the main room where your church gathers on Sunday mornings? What do you call the front of that room from which the teaching or preaching comes? Thirdly, where do you preach or teach from? Name the spot in your youth space. And the final question was, make some comments on why those names have been chosen for those spaces. And what I heard, several dozen responses. Stage was a big one. I heard stage a lot. I heard platform a lot in terms of the place up front. I don't think anybody used the word chancel, which is old. And by the way, I grew up in one of those conservative evangelical churches that was in the main line. So the architecture was a huge part of what we learned when we were growing up and what we experienced. So the word chancel, the word pulpit, those were familiar to me. Then for the main room, I heard worship center, auditorium. Only a couple called it a sanctuary. And when I asked, about what is the thinking behind this, most people said, I have no clue. No defined reason, really. That's what anybody off the street would call it. And I did have one person push back and just say, auditorium and stage suggest performance or entertainment. And they used that as a justification for why they called it, something else like a pulpit or a chancel. Can you comment on that a bit, and maybe say, with a lack of thought, what kind of thought do we need to begin to put into this?
Yeah, that's thanks, Walt. When I think of the different terms that we attach to it, and I've heard other words, church center, worship center, gathering place, and auditorium and stuff like that. I think it could be argued that when we call a place, a space, an auditorium, that and this is maybe just a McAlpineism or whatnot, but what I read into that is the main function that's going to go on in that space is auditory. In other words, we want people to come and listen. So we will give you comfortable seating to keep your body out of the way. And in evangelical conservative churches, we're not even going to give you kneeling benches because, heck, we don't want you kneeling in our services. Holy cow, what do you think this is? So we will have the auditorium says this is where we gather to listen. What I discovered, I grew up in a Baptist church in Toronto where we called it the sanctuary. Can you believe it? A sanctuary. But that was the whole thing. From the back of the church right up to the baptistry, the whole thing was sanctuary. Discover that in a Roman Catholic church, a sanctuary is a very limited space that often lay people don't go into the sanctuary. It's up at the very front. The part that we would call where everybody sits, they call the nave. The part that you come into the nave from is the narthex. So I always had to get used to all these different terminologies. And there are some who would say, really, does it matter? And I guess in a sense it could be argued, maybe not, but I think it does say something about our understanding of that space. I know some people have, I've had conversations with pastors who backed away from terms like sanctuary or worship center because they want to believe that any place in that whole church building is a space where worship can happen. So to say it worship center is to say that it can only happen here in the center. And I think people are starting to think about it. The whole issue, of course, and I've heard the similar conversations or comments about performance. We don't call it a stage, we call it a platform. Well, in our day and age, platforms got something to do with online technology. So what are you going to do with that? So the rationale behind the design of these gathering spaces, I think probably we need to think more carefully about what it is that we're actually calling it, because the labels often reflect the thought behind and even say the theology behind it.
Let me jump in there for a minute, because I think that was probably one of the parts of your book, Bill, that I appreciated the most. I grew up in a large Methodist church, and it was Gothic in architecture, big, huge, pendulous chandeliers hung down, and we would sit in the balcony and calculate, who would they hit if they fell, and and I remember there was an area called the narthex, which to me kind of sounded like a metal band, at the Civic Center, narthex, two shows. But what I found helpful in reading this book, especially the chapter in which you kind of reflect on the historical rationale that led people to kind of think about the sanctuary the way they thought about it, is that even with all of the all the time I've been in ministry, and like these other guys, you go to seminary and all that, I really was not aware of how much thought and reflection by my brothers and sisters in Christ over 2 millennia had gone into why these things were done the way they were done. I mean, it was first of all just a vocabulary. It really, to think of the Rudloft, for example, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but I had to look that up the first time you mentioned it. I'd never kind of figured that out. And then I found nave and chancel and some of that, but it was really helpful to recognize that part of the problem here, I think, or part of the just the reality here is that most of us have not given any or much thought to these things, and are not aware that our brothers and sisters in Christ have done so, and so we haven't really availed ourselves of their reflection and the contributions of their reflection. I think that was a real wake-up call for me in your book.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks, Duffy. Yeah, look, it was a steep learning curve for me too, to get my mind around these different monikers or handles that we put on different parts of the sanctuary. But the part of what I mean, I had the same experience you described there. It was like drawing the curtains back and understanding the significance, and actually understanding that nothing in many of those ancient churches, nothing was merely ornamental, incidental, or whatever. They were all intentional. You go back to the cathedrals, they were built when the average person was illiterate. So the only Bible that they read literally was in their church building, whether that be with frescoes and paintings, but also the very design and structure, cruciform buildings. They're in the shape of a cross, that whole building. You enter into this building that's shaped like a cross, not because that's cute, but because that was a pivotal part of their theology. And the building reflected it as much as their sermons and homilies and sacraments.
Yeah, even that part of it, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but even the idea that the chancel area where the altar, that sort of space was at the east end of the building, or at the east end of the cross. Could you talk about just I mean, that'd be a good, just a kind of a case study. Now, what was the rationale? What was the intention behind that?
Yeah, it's a great question. If you go back and look at the history of that, if you go back far enough, what we'll understand is that in ancient temples, the main entrance was always on the east, right? So, and that was so that when the sun rose, the sun would come in and shine through those main doors and land somewhere on an altar or a sacred artifact that was right there. When Christianity came on the scene and saw this, this is the culture that they were immersed in. They said, okay, that's a pagan religion. We're going to do the exact opposite. So when you go to a cathedral in Europe, guess what direction your main doors are going to face? They're going to face west. So they took the building and turned it right around, so that rather than coming in from the east, you come in from the west, and up at the east is where the main altar was going to be. So you have a north transept and a south transept, which forms the cross. But that's why, like, if you get lost in Europe and you're in a small European town, guarantee you somewhere there'll be a cathedral. You don't know which way is north. Find the cathedral, because the main door will be west. That'll be facing west. The altar will be up at the east. North is to the left, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the Christians did it not to make a positive statement, but to say, this is who we're not. Sounds kind of familiar. But they were saying what the pagan religions did by having an eastern door, we're doing the opposite. Our main door is going to come in the opposite direction. That's one history of it.
Yeah.
Hey, this is good. We need to take a break, and I do want to swing it around when we come back to the larger picture, or from the larger picture of the church building, and get down a little bit more into the youth room and how we as youth workers can start to think about this, because I do think it's important. We're chatting with Bill McAlpine about his book, Sacred Space for the Missional Church. We want to apply it to youth ministry, and an extra added bonus here is that Duffy's taken us off on a need to talk about how to get teenagers to pay attention in church through his own confessions there. So we'll come back and we'll pick up on this discussion. We'll be right back. Stick with us. Here at CPYU, we want to help you help parents stay up to date on today's youth culture. One of our most popular resources is our monthly parent page. This 4-page full-color resource offers parents a timely, practical look into current youth culture trends, along with resources to help them parent their children and teens Christianly in today's rapidly changing youth culture. If you're a youth worker who would like to get this monthly resource into the hands of your parents, you can see a sample parent page and learn more by visiting cpyuparentpage.com. Well, welcome back, everybody, to Youth Culture Matters. We're having a conversation about space. We're talking about church and, all the messages that are there explicitly or implicitly in the way we design our buildings and the way we design our meeting space, our worship space. And we're going to turn the conversation to youth rooms because that's a big part of, what we're doing in youth ministry. And I know a lot of you who are listening are spending a lot of time constructing your space. Before I turn it over to Marv, he's got a couple of questions here. I found this. I thought this was great. I think, and Bill, you mentioned this as well. I stumbled upon this in a couple of different places, but this great quote from Winston Churchill. So after the bombing and the House of Commons, the chamber of the House of Commons was destroyed, they talked, this is World War II, they were talking over in Britain about, how do we rebuild? What do we rebuild? Do we do something new? And Churchill was adamant. Imagine that. Churchill was adamant. Churchill was adamant about building what they had, the exact same thing. And he wanted that. And there's this great quote on the importance of architecture attributed to him. He said, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." That's powerful. And by the way, after I heard that, I thought, man, so that's where McLuhan got, first we shape our tools and afterwards our tools shape us, Marshall McLuhan. But that is a powerful statement. And keep that in mind, everybody, because that's really at the core of what we're talking about here. Marv, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Yeah. The first 15 minutes have certainly been stimulating and interesting. Had no idea about that East-West thing and learning a new vocabulary here. But from the perspective of a youth worker, I'm going, wait a minute. I don't have the luxury of an architect who's going to design a theologically significant space. My youth group meets in the broom closet behind the ladies' restroom in the basement of my church because that's the only space they're going to give me. Or my youth group meets in the Jones Memorial Room where we're not allowed to have any food or drinks because the ladies' quilting group meets tomorrow morning. My fear is that youth workers are going to kind of feel a sense of helplessness. We're in rooms that are basically drywall, gyprock, whatever, with fluorescent lights and a couple of folding tables and a stack of chairs. Is there a way for us, for most of us, even to have a place in making our spaces significant? Are there sort of low investment, high return kinds of things that we can do? I mean, I know very few youth workers who have the luxury of designing a youth building or a youth space. We get shoved wherever they think we need to go, and then we have to kind of make the best of it. So that feels like the real world of youth ministry architecture to me. And I'd love to know where we go with that. Or is that just too pessimistic?
No,
it was wonderfully optimistic.
It wasn't. Marv, that was the best, most flowery descriptor I've heard in a long time. It was brilliant. I loved it.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
That's why I'm here.
It just kept going. It was great.
If I'm in a fetal position, I mean, that was really inspiring.
That was great, Mark.
But hey, I'm looking at 8 youth workers in the room here, all going, yeah, I know what that's like.
Yeah. Well, let me say this, Marv. That's not just a youth ministry phenomena. You guys don't have the corner on that. That's the reality in a lot of churches. My home church in Calgary here, we're 3 years into our brand spanking new building. And we wrestled with whether or not that main space would be dedicated space or multifunctional space. And the argument is it should be dedicated space, that the only thing that goes on in there is the preaching of the word, the sacraments, and all those kinds of things. The reality is we don't have money for that. Our building costs enough as it is, so we have to go to the multifunctional space. So how do you turn something that is going to be used for a number of different purposes by a number of different groups, different times? How do you make that have any sense? How do you create any sense of sacrality, of the holy presence of God? Can we do that? And, it comes back to, a statement. I had a good friend used to teach with me, and he said, Bill, I think all this stuff you're talking about sacred space, you're blowing it out your ear, because it doesn't matter where we worship, only that we worship. And I'm going to disagree with that. And we can maybe get into that conversation a little later. But to talk to your question, Marv, I think it's a great question. And I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on in preparation for our conversation today is this. I don't think we give the youth of today enough credit for their ability and their desire to think seriously and theologically, even about things like sacred space.
Here.
We got to give these kids some airtime, because they're saying stuff to us honking boomers at times that we need to be listening to. I teach largely millennials, and so the millennials and high school kids that I have contact with, they're given every indication to me is that the where really is important. We've got, and I think what I would say, Marv, is find out. I'd say to your youth workers, find out who in your youth group are the artists. Find out who in your youth group have got a sense of color, of proportion, of material, of lighting, huge, of all that kind of stuff. Well, some of them they're not going to be there yet, but some are. And turn them loose. Give them part of a budget and say, here's some money. And what we want you to do each week is we want you to create, okay, this week our focus is going to be on, let's just example, say meditation. Okay, what kind of environment is going to be conducive to and enhance something along meditation? Okay, I'd say youth leaders, turn the artist loose. And yeah, that's risky.
Yeah.
You might not, but I think let's give the young people more credit than we have been willing to, I think, and say, let them create a space, because they're going to tell you what is meaningful to them. So, and a second question I would say, Marv, is what do you want your youth group to experience in that space? Right? Do you want them to slow down? Do you want them is this going to be something you want them to learn? Do you want them to have community? Okay, so what do you want to see take place? What do you want them to experience? And then the second question would be, so what kind of environment is that going to mean? And I don't think you need a Gothic cathedral to create an environment that causes awe, that generates awe. There's a lot of ways you can do that, and a lot of ways that don't have to cost a lot of money.
Bill, would you talk to? Could you speak to maybe the opposite situation that Marv's just brought to us there? And let me give you a little background and maybe some explanation of what I'm thinking here. Hopefully, I can communicate this clearly, because I'm finding, or I suspect, and in some of my conversations I'm finding this, that a lot of youth workers, when they get a budget, they are sinking a lot of money into, sort of the stuff to create the sense in the room. And it's interesting to me what you're saying, because a lot of it's not that stuff. What I'm seeing and hearing is a lot of technology and the creation of more of like a performance space. So is there, just from your perspective there and thinking about the theology of that, even if this is just your personal opinion, how would you advise a youth worker who's been given a hunk of money in a setting where they're seeing a lot of their peers do this very thing, with the staging, the lighting, the fog machines, things like that, And I do think there's a time and a place for that, obviously, in ministry. I'm giving you my own opinion here. But I think we are really, the scales have really tilted towards that. Even to the point where I spoke at a church recently, and I spoke in the youth room, and I stood on a stage. I always ask, can I get off of there and be down on the floor? But technologically, they couldn't make that happen. But the youth room was not that big. They had seating there for like 30 people. But they had a full, band set up there and lighting, and they didn't turn the fog machines on for me. But they had all this and this big sound system and everything, and I'm thinking 30 people. There's theology in that, right? And so there's kind of some theology is going into that, whether it's conscious or unconscious, and there's something that's coming out of it in terms of what it's teaching. Do you know what I'm asking here? Or I'm wanting you to respond to that. How do we? Let's put the brakes on for a minute. Bill, give us some good advice on how to construct our space that would lead towards spiritual growth and the outcomes we want to see.
Yeah, great. That's just a great question. Well, I think number one, for anybody involved in youth ministry, it is absolutely essential that you understand the culture of that particular group. The church that Marv and I served on together had a culture all of its own. You go 5 miles down the road to First Alliance Church, and you've got an entirely different youth group culture. So just because somebody has state-of-the-art technology, good stage, expensive equipment, good instruments and all that stuff in Sacramento, nothing against Sacramento, but that's probably not going to work really well in Coronach, Saskatchewan. In fact, I know it won't. However, so I think number one is like understanding. Do we really understand our kids? Do you understand the kids? And secondly, and very importantly, what do you want to see happen in the lives of those kids? That, I think those two questions are going to, to a large degree, should impinge on or inform the design of the spaces that we provide for them to happen. I had a conversation with a guy named Scott Traeger, who was on staff at Willow Creek. And they were about to move into their new 7,200 seat sanctuary or auditorium from their small 4,500 seat, their original. And I asked him this question. I said, Scott, what do you want people to experience when they walk into that space? Without hesitation, he said there are three things. Number one, we want them to slow down. This West Barrington, Illinois, the Chicago area, people live in a frenetic pace. So we want, when they walk into this space, we want them to slow down. Secondly, most importantly, we want them to have an encounter with God. And thirdly, we want them to experience genuine, authentic community. So my question to Scott was, are you saying to me that you believe that the built environment that you're putting together can affect all three? He said, absolutely. It's taken us 7 years to design it. And that took into account lighting, the material, what was carpeted, what wasn't, and sight lines, not only to what's going on the platform, but sight lines to those who are there with me. So I think when it comes to this kind of design, if we don't understand the culture and the chemistry and the personality of our kids, then no matter what you do, you're going to probably do something wrong. So you start there. And then secondly, if you're not 100% clear, what is your mission? What's your vision for this group? What do you want? What are you trusting God to do in the lives of these kids? Then what kind of space is going to help us see that come to fruition? And I think for us to say, like I did for decades, well, it doesn't matter. Space doesn't matter. It absolutely does matter. And as often as not, how many times have churches put up buildings, youth groups have put up youth rooms, only to find that the room or the space mitigates against what they're trying to do or say? It's because we haven't given thought to it. We haven't seen that there's theology in the space and the environment.
I have a question here from one of the students who may be addressing this. You're talking about your space should align with your mission for your ministry. What is it we're called to do, and is our space intentionally pursuing that? So, if in fact our approach to creating space has to do with trying to be as culturally relevant as possible, so that we do make it look like a club in there, because our kids are comfortable in a club culture. Does that actually reinforce the notion that we're called to be in the world but not of the world? Is that a valid reason? If we're about outreach, we're going to try to make our space as culturally compatible as possible, and we can rationalize that by saying, well, we want kids who don't have a church background to be able to come in here. It's one thing to talk about putting kids in awe of God, but it's another thing to create a space where students will be willing to come off the street and join us. How do you blend those two?
Well, that's great. Great question. I think if our intention is to mimic or copy what the world has to offer, let's be honest, we suck at that. So let's not do that. So let's create something that is going to, it's going to be a place where people are comfortable to come into it. And for a while, I think what we've bought into, and it makes me nervous, I think we bought into a bogus concept that any kind of religious symbol is going to be offensive to everybody. Well, yeah, like some people are going to be offended by the color of my socks, for crying out loud. And the reality is the gospel is offensive. It's going to be offensive. So for us to create a safe place, I'd like someone to define, what do you mean a safe place? What makes a safe place? The gospel's not safe. The gospel radically revolutionized my life, and that's what it will do. It will turn it upside down. If you're looking for safety, that's a whole other issue. But I think the tension comes between which drummer are we walking to, and there's concern that we're just mimicking culture. Well, if we're doing it just to be cool, then I don't think that's good enough reason. However, on the other side, like Howard Marshall said, the gospel has never been acultural. The gospel was born into a culture, and it's going to reflect. It's never meant to destroy or annihilate culture. The gospel is meant to redeem culture. And I like what John Wesley said. You plunder the Egyptians. There's gold in our culture. There's some unmitigated distressing stuff as well. But gosh, I can find that in the church too. So I think it's that finding that balance between allowing culture to dictate in almost a dictatorial sense what we do and how we operate. And the other end of it is to just completely ignore culture and say that nothing good can come out of culture. And I think we need to be willing to have conversation and listen to what's going to be meaningful to our kids. So I think having your youth space like a club, like that's not going to reach everybody. There's going to be some kids are going to be turned off. They don't like clubs. They don't go to clubs. Yeah. And their parents who give offerings on Sunday are probably not going to. They might withdraw other offerings.
Hey, sorry, Bill. Before we hit a break, I two thoughts here in response to that question. One would be, and that was a great question, and I think that's a question a lot of people are asking, and I love that, cultural relevance. The one thought was this, that when we bow to cultural relevance, we will never be able to step back and say we're done designing this space. What'll happen is we're in a constant move to redesign, and I think that can become mission one, where we're trying so hard to be relevant because, you can't keep up with styles. There's planned obsolescence. in the world of style, and to find a place to step back from that and find some relief would actually be a wonderful thing. And I almost believe that at times, I know in my own life, that if you try to cave to style, this could be a great tool in the hand of the enemy to get us off of what our mission and task should be, because we focus on that. And so there's always that. But the other thing is you talked about the drummer. I think you said which drummer you're going to walk to. And I think the gospel calls us to walk away from one drummer to walk with another. And so, I'm just thinking about that related to space. So let's take a break. We're going to come back and continue our conversation. Tens of thousands of kids have been trained by their parents and youth workers to think Christianly about music and media with our How to Use Your Head to Guard Your Heart 3D guide to making wise media choices. This easy-to-use teaching tool needs to be in your youth ministry toolbox if you desire to teach your students to integrate their faith into all of life. Jesus calls us to follow him, and that includes following him into the 6 to 9 hours a day of screen time that shape and mold the beliefs and behaviors of our kids. To learn more about our 3D Media Evaluation Guide and to order a copy for every member of your youth group, go to our website at cpyu.org. Teach your kids to engage with media to the glory of God. Well, let's continue this discussion. Duffy, you had a couple of things you wanted to ask or bring up.
Yeah, actually, more than a couple. I mean, I'm just fascinated by this topic, and it's provoking all kinds of thoughts. And so, Bill, I'm just going to kind of throw out a veritable merry-go-round of questions, and you just grab wherever you want to get on, okay? But I'll just throw out a few here. So one thing I'm thinking of is I know sometimes in youth ministry land, we talk about using the sanctuary for games. I mean, I might have myself when I was youth pastor, maybe done a finger blaster war in a sanctuary. I'm going to guess that you wouldn't be a big fan of that. But what about, for example, the idea of using the chancel area, the altar area for some sort of sharing time or some sort of confession time. So that's just one question. In other words, we've been talking about the youth room. I'm asking a question about the sanctuary space. Here's another question: is what about people who say, and while we were offline here, Chris went out to have a smoke. Marv talked about this and said that what about the idea? Frank Viola, in his book Pagan Christianity, he wrote with George Barna, talks about, this is pretty much I think the consensus is that the church is not a space. It's not a place. It's a people. And you address this in the book, but I haven't really heard you necessarily. We haven't asked you to, but you haven't had a chance yet to. I think to convincingly speak to that, because for example, you made a statement early in the book about the Missio Dei, the mission of God, and that we work so hard on trying to figure out how we're to do this, that we forget who we are to be, that we are to be dispensers of God's grace, and that sort of shapes some of these decisions as well. Another question is it even appropriate for me as a youth pastor to go, I need to create with the same, certainly with intentionality, but am I supposed to kind of create another quote unquote sanctuary in the youth room? Or should there be a sanctuary where the entire congregation, it kind of speaks to that dichotomy between the youth, there's sort of youth church and there's big church, and maybe by trying to create this space that is, it is kind of its own sacred space, that maybe I'm actually duplicating something that should not be duplicated, maybe. And then the last one is, I think if I were to say what really impressed me about this whole discussion and what provoked me is just the intentionality. Because I think about, for example, Walt talking about standing up on a stage and how artificial it feels to me to be speaking to a group of, 50 students on a stage that's 5 feet above them. And it seems like we're trying to sort of mimic, we're trying to pretend we are this large thing when we're not, and in fact we don't need to be. Or how often I'm supposed to kind of preach from the scripture, but the room is dark, and so kids couldn't see the Bible if they had one, because they stopped bringing them because they can't read them in the dark. So there are tons of questions. Love the book. I'm going to stop there so we have time for you to respond to some of that stuff.
Okay. Wow, those are great questions. So my answer is yes.
Okay, Marv, how about you?
Great. The one, let me address the one, Duffy, you talked about, having a youth church room, a church space that is separate from the main gathering place. I have a really good friend who worked at a church, youth pastor for several years, where they actually had their own building. And it was a magnificent building. I mean, they had all kinds of space, but their gathering space was a performance center. It really was. You could have had a mini concert there. And so the youth did not meet at the 11 o'clock service with the main event, with their parents. They just had their church service. And in talking with my buddy, I think as he looks back on that, he's not convinced that actually says the right thing and is the best thing. The rationale behind that, a kind of move like that, I understand. Because unfortunately, my generation, we've been indicted, rightly or wrongly, for making really boring gatherings. So, kids would rather go watch paint dry than be in our worship gatherings. Well, I also think, though, that there's I'm intrigued with, and I've had conversations even this last month with people about the increase in the call for intergenerational stuff, including small groups, including worship gatherings and whatnot. So I guess what I would encourage, not just the youth workers, but certainly youth workers, but in conversation with the rest of church leadership, this needs to be a transgenerational conversation. I hope it's not just youth leaders that are concerned about our young people. I'm a senior citizen, and I'm milking the system for every discount I can get. But I love the young people in our church, and I want them to know they're loved. And maybe one of the ways that we're going to, and I'm on our elders board, so one of the ways that we're going to make sure that they know that is they've got space, that it can be their space. It's going to be slightly different, but we also want them together with us in the main event place. So intergenerational stuff, I think, comes into the conversation when we're talking about having our own youth room. Shoot, I was going to say something else in there. What was one of the other questions, Duffy?
Well, what about the way we used, there were about 5 or 6 of them, but what about the way we use the sanctuary space for
right.
because you did mention the multi-purpose thing, and yeah. that raises another kind of part of the question. But then there's also where you really do have sanctuary space that, like at an older church, but then you say, okay, we're going to go in there and do something.
Yeah. This came up in a conversation I had with a Roman Catholic priest who became a friend of mine, and in their church, their nave sanctuary is dedicated to sacraments and rites. So they won't even play secular music in there. It's not a place where they encourage people to fellowship and hang around and have communion. They have a community hall for that. And they've got the largest space dedicated to sacramental activity. Okay, I'm not on that page. I don't know that that's going to be feasible for very many churches at all. Plus, I think, our relationship with God has always got to be taken in association with a relationship with one another, and that has to go in those spaces. So, but the idea, for example, of using what is going to be the Sunday morning gathering or the Saturday night gathering as a youth room for futsal or what they call Dutch Blitz or something like that. So just raucous game. I know there are some people that would say that is that's just not right. It shouldn't be used that. And I used to think that way, quite frankly. But in my old age, I'm starting to think, but maybe could we not say that the redemption story is not just about redeeming our souls. It's about redeeming play. It's about redeeming my whole life. It's about redeeming everything that I do. And that might mean playing around. And why not have a space that, yes, I can play a game in here on Friday night with the kids and know that I'm going to come back here and gather around the communion table and that not be a major speed bump. So I think I've changed, and that's I would say that's in the last 5 years or so. Marv.
No, to me, the big takeaway from this conversation is around the word intentionality. When you talk about the history of architecture in the church, the key word seems to be intentional or purposeful, and my concern is for those of us who do youth ministry without any intentionality in terms of the atmosphere that we're creating, and I think that instead of allowing our space to determine our mission, we should revisit what it is that we're trying to accomplish. It's relational, it's recreational, it's educational, it's all of those things. And so for us to say, in order to accomplish that mission, what's the best way for me to leverage whatever space I have? What are some simple things that we can do to create some intentionality around this? And then I think that sociologically, those of us in youth ministry know that for adolescents, one of the big themes is a place to belong. So is this a place that fosters a sense of belonging? Is this a place that students can say, hey, this is our space, or this is my space that I come to? And obviously the challenge is that we have multiple purposes, maybe more diverse purposes in youth ministry than we do in big church. And so we have to make one space work for multiple purposes. But that doesn't mean we can't be intentional about it. And so to me, the big takeaway here is to go back, for youth workers to walk into their youth space, look at it and say, what is this space communicating to a student who walks in the door? To what extent is this space making it easy for us to achieve the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? Are there some simple things that we could do here that would allow us to be more intentional about communicating with our space? And I hope that's what people are walking away with, knowing how unique everybody's situation is.
Can I just add to that? I think the other big part. I mean, it's such a fundamental piece of your book, but I think it just overlooked too easily is that we are embodied people, and that space matters. So that when I'm thinking about intention, I have to realize that space plays into my intention. I can't just think of space as simply neutral. So thank you. You've washed a lot of windows for us today so we can see through them. Appreciate it.
They have been stained glass windows.
Just to follow up on that, I'm thinking, from what you said, Marv, what you said, Duffy, that one of the questions that I think youth workers need to be intentional about asking is, how are we shaping and or I hope not misshaping, because that's where, change needs to take place, teens students as they walk out the door, because you're talking about drawing them in, but even as they walk out of the door, what's the message that we're sending, them out with? So, I think really being about that. And then there's one other thing I just go back to, and this would serve as you guys know me, this is more of a kind of a pushback on our youth ministry world. I was thinking about the first youth ministry text that I'm aware of that was ever written, that big blue volume by Larry Richards called Youth Ministry. And there was a mantra he had in there. When I read that book, I'll never forget. He said, people, not programs, people, not programs, people, not programs. Right. And I wonder if today we need to change it in this world that's so wrapped up in style, so wrapped up in pizzazz, so wrapped up in, being culturally relevant, that we have to say people, not props, people, not props, people, not props. And, because I think sometimes we lean on the wrong props. So, as we construct our space, which, as Bill has said, is so important,
But if that's true, Walt, if that's true, props, if space matters, props matter.
Well, yeah.
I know we're trying to wrap up here.
Well, programs do too, right? we all do programs, but ultimately it's about the people. Saying. Yeah, what's your top priority? That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And you and I have 2 weeks together coming up, so I know now what we'll be talking about for 2 weeks. This is going to be a great discussion. So good, Bill. I'm going to give you the last word here, and anything you want to say to a final parting sentence or two to youth workers as they think about space, because it is important to us, and we are, we're concerned about this. We want to do something with our space and do it well.
Yeah, thanks, Marv and Walt and Duffy. It's been a great conversation. I think one of the things that I was going to emphasize, and it has been emphasized several times already, and that is a matter of being intentional. So I'm not going to expand much more on that because it's been so eloquently addressed already. But sacred space that's going to be meaningful and effective does not just happen serendipitously. It happens because it's been intended, prayerfully considered and intended to happen. The other thing that relates to that, there are two things. The matter of, four, is longevity. Like when you design your space, how long do you think this is going to last? Marv and I were when we had the conversation when we were off the air here about the cathedrals, about they were very intentional, yet they're empty. What's interesting? I wish we had time, maybe for another conversation. How did the world respond when Notre Dame went up in flames? Mm-hmm. Hey, it's only bricks and mortar. What's the worry? Just a building. Well, obviously it was not a building. How many? If our church building, well, one of our alliance churches in Alberta burnt down. It went through, but it didn't make CBC News. Why was that? Well, for one thing, it took over 200 years to build Notre Dame. It's been there for 865 years. So the longevity of it is, we're not going to build buildings like that anymore. And your youth room is probably going to only last 1 or 2 generations. Well, what's a generation? Used to be 25 years. According to the academic world, the third-year student is a generation removed from the first-year student. So it's about 18 to 24 months. So how long? So that means not only being intentional, but consider how long do you want this space to function the way it is. And that means we need to be flexible. I think it came out in conversation earlier. Being able to, stuff is not set in permanent concrete, as it were. And by way of suggestion, like how do you make any space have a sense of the sacred? First of all, I think we can learn a lot from the social sciences. We can learn a lot from, I've read tons from environmental psychologists and sociologists and architectural people. We need to listen to them, folks. And they need to listen to us as theologians, whether you're a youth theologian or pastoral theologian, whatever. But one of the things, we can learn a lot from designers of, for example, shopping malls. There's nothing strictly ornamental. They're intentional the way they design it. You pay more for a store that's on the right-hand side of an entrance than you do on the left. You pay more rent per square foot because they've done the psychology, the environmental psychology. They know that people behave certain ways in certain environments. I think for us in our youth rooms, our youth spaces, I would say make sure there are focal points. Whether or not that's a cross, it doesn't necessarily have to be a cross, but places that draw your attention. So one of the exercises I have students do is they have to go visit a church completely outside their tradition. And they, one of the first questions they say, when you walk in that space, what grabs your attention and where is your sight taken? You walk into a cathedral, your sight's going to be taken upward because architecturally it's designed with clerestory lighting, and the lights up there, you're going to naturally go up there. When you walk into the average youth room, what's going to be, and I encourage youth workers, walk into your youth room as if you're an uninitiated kid and say, where's my attention drawn? Is there anything that draws my attention, that intrigues me, that interests me? Is it a piece of art, or is it a forest of music stands and mics and all that stuff? What's going to draw? So focal points. And then make it space for people to move around in easily. So the days of pews are gone. Do you have to have chairs all the time? Maybe have a Greek Orthodox service that lasts for about 2 or 3 hours, and they have no seating except for the aged and infirmed around. So have a seat if I come visit. But try that sometime. Be experimental. Be willing to try different arrangements and configurations. And I know that can wreak havoc on the janitorial team of your facilities per se, but I think people like predictability, but there is also room for surprise. So I don't know if that answers, if that gives you anything there. I think the intentionality, think of how long this is going to be appropriate, flexibility, have focal points. And the last thing I would say is this: whether we accept it or realize it or not, your space conveys a message. Make sure it's saying the same thing your mouth is.
That's good. Well, thank you. Well, folks, thanks to Duffy, thanks to Marv, thanks to Bill. We will, as we always do, post on our homepage, cpyu.org, where you find Youth Culture Matters and the player for this episode. Beneath that, we'll have some resources listed for you, links to those. You can click through to those and access. And if you would, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a good review. That's helpful. So thanks so much, guys, and we'll be back again.
Thank you.
With the next episode of Youth Culture Matters.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.